Thank you very much and welcome to this 13th Railway Talk of the UEEIV. My name is Marco Corradini. I will introduce this conference this evening, and I want to say just a few words before giving the words to the speaker. We had our last Railway Talk in February, and then it was planned another Railway Talk in March, but we decided, as you can read in our homepage, web page, that we will give the opportunity to go directly in Switzerland by their Eisenbahnbetrieb. So it will be possible to organize this. We are thinking about in autumn. Okay, then I come to the today conference. I remember how it works. I will introduce the speaker. The speaker will do his presentation, and at the end, we will have the possibility to put the question if we have questions. I want to remember that the next Railway Talk will be organized on the 9th of June, and the time will be the same as today. So, as after this short introduction from me, I give the word to Noel Dolphin. Noel is the head of Feron & Fry in UK, and the topic of this evening is best practices and lesson learned for product approval. I hope it will be an interesting presentation. So, Noel, I give you the words.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marco. I will share my slides. I'm hoping you can all see this now.
Yes.
Brilliant. Good. Yes. Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Noel Dolphin from Feron & Fry. Yeah, thank you, Charlotte and Marco, for organising and running this evening, and everyone for attending. Yeah, I work for Feron & Fry. You may have heard us if you're based in Europe, mainly from electrification. In the UK, we are slightly different as we also cover wider consultancy. So the topic I'm going through this evening isn't limited to electrification, but covers all assets, albeit I put up a picture of Midland Main Line here in the UK and some of the electrification renewals that were happening there last year. For the last 6 months, I've been working on a report for the Office of Rail and Road, which is the UK rail regulator, on the UK's product approval process and what we can learn from various European countries. So what's the best practice from around Europe, how we can apply that to the UK, and I hope also some of those lessons will be applicable for some of you across Europe as well. The report itself was written for the ORR, and they've reviewed it and accepted it. However, the presentation here is my own summary of that. So this is my own views on the report I've written, and not those of the regulator. The actual report was written for two of the engineers at the ORR, Dermot Kelly and Morena Corrie. So yeah, I want to say thanks to them because they've been a big part of this process as well. So yeah, product approval. There are lots of names for it, be it homologation, product acceptance, product approval. Essentially, it is how new products accepted for use on the railway from whatever asset that is. And we're looking at the processes here. When I often dial into presentations at events such as this, I'm looking at interesting engineering. And we can all look at lots of interesting engineering projects and innovations, and they're often exciting and interesting. But actually, some of the processes that underpin that probably have a bigger impact on cost and efficiency. So yeah, this is looking at some of those processes that underline that. And we want to get, as a railway, we want passengers and goods to get to where they need to go on time, affordably, and sustainably. And the processes that govern the railway will have a big impact on that. So yeah, firstly, my background, and yeah, I put a few videos from my background just to make the slide more interesting. Hopefully, I can get yeah, all the videos to play. Yeah, I want to give you a little bit of background to understand where I come from. I've been working in railways for over 25 years, initially in London Underground, so Transport for London, managing projects on the subsurface lines. And for those who don't know London, the subsurface lines are the cut and cover lines, so the ones near to the surface, such as the District Line, Metropolitan Line, Circle, and Hammersmith and City. I then went to work for Network Rail, who's the National Infrastructure Manager, managing renewals projects. And in that time, I took a lot of new products and new systems through the Network Rail product acceptance process as a client and as a sponsor. And for just over the past 10 years, I've been working for Fur and Frey, also taking products through the product acceptance process, but this time as a supplier. So a completely different perspective. And so, yeah, for almost 25 years, from half of it working client side to half of it as a supplier, I've been dealing with products through that acceptance process. So when the ORR were looking at someone to come in and review the product acceptance process, I was really interested in doing the study. So I spent 6 months. The final report was published last month in March, and these are some of the findings we're going to go through today. For those who are interested in the videos, the top left is some short circuit testing I did in Prevange in Switzerland. Bottom left was fatigue testing on jumpers I did with the University of Birmingham. Top right was short circuit, testing of an arc catcher for a carrier wire neutral section at Melton Mulberry at Network Rail's test track. And the bottom right is again a Network Rail's Melton Mulberry test track. This was construction trials before we did some pantograph testing there. So the pantograph here was actually on a construction vehicle before we brought a real train in. So yeah, I've had 25 years in product approval and testing. So I'm going to go through some of the findings of the past 6 months study we've done. So yeah, here's the agenda. I've already gone through the introduction, so have covered that. I will give an overview of the structure of how the UK rail sector works for those who are not familiar with it. Then through the scope and objectives of the study itself, how the UK currently works and what the issues we had already identified. I wanted to cover a small section on business cultures and then look at what railways we compared the UK to, what were the findings of that, and then try and wrap that up with some lessons learned. So yeah, firstly, the UK rail sector, and here's a diagram to explain it. It's actually a lot simpler than it looks. And so if you already know the UK, roughly how the UK railway works, this may be a little repetitious, but I wanted to explain it for those who don't. So firstly, we're looking at the mainline rail structure in the UK. So places like London Underground, Tyne and Wear Metro, Glasgow Subway, Liverpool and Manchester Metros, etc., are not covered in this. This is just our mainline mainline railway, sorry. Network Rail is the infrastructure manager, so they maintain and renew the tracks, the signalling, the electrification of the mainline railway. and Network Rail is a wholly owned government company. Network Rail itself reports into the Department of Transport, which is the government department in charge of transport, and the minister in charge of that is the Secretary of State for Transport. So Network Rail reports into the Secretary of State for Transport. We have train operating companies, and some of those work for companies directly owned by the Department of Transport. Others are franchised operations. We also have freight operators who in the UK are entirely private companies. On the left, we have the Office of Rail and Road, and that's the government regulator, and they regulate both safety and economics. So essentially, they're there to ensure the railway is safe and that it runs efficiently. So they're the regulator who manage Network Rail. We also have some other bodies. So on the bottom, we have a few other bodies there. The most relevant to this is the Rail Safety and Standards Board, RSSB, and they manage some of the group standards. So what I'm really focusing on as part of this study was Network Rail's product approval processes and the standards that underpin that. In the UK, we also have other standards and laws that impact on product approvals. So things like national specification notices, which are NTSNs, which are the equivalent of European TSIs. We also have group standards, which are managed by the Railway Safety and Standards Board, as well as law and regulations as well, which is managed by the Department of Transport. So they all have an impact on how we manage the railway and its processes, but most of the things I'm covering today will be standards within Network Rail, the infrastructure manager. However, I'm also focusing on a snapshot in time, so what the standards are now. Again, for those familiar with the UK rail market, the UK is slowly transitioning, so track and trains are run by a single organisation. So in future, that will be Great British Railways. And when that happens, the standards and rules will change considerably. But I can't predict what some of those are. So we're reviewing where we are now. But hopefully some of this report will inform decisions made in the future. So yeah, what was the scope of the study? So yeah, again, to go back on to the naming, there are lots of names. The formal name in the UK is product acceptance. However, we often use a colloquialism of product approval, which essentially means the same thing. Homologation against standards, etc., are other similar words. But I'm talking about the same thing. I'm talking about how products get approved to be used on the infrastructure. The Office of Rail and Road, which I'll refer to as now on just ORR. So in the UK, I would just call them ORR. It's the Office of Rail and Roads, a tongueful. But their main objective is to support a safer railway that also delivers value for money. And Network Rail itself is required to maintain the railway in a timely, efficient and economical manner in accordance with best practice. So its actual license it receives from the government to manage the railway requires it to be timely, efficient, economical, and to follow best practice. So this review focuses on one element. We want to be efficient, deliver value for money, and do so safely. But how do we gauge, are we doing it against best practice? So part of this study is looking around Europe to see what best practice is, and then comparing Network Rail to see if they are meeting that best practice. For this study, the ORR also gave us 3 additional requirements. We need to look at how responsive Network Rail was to innovation. Do they put too onerous a burden on suppliers? Because eventually that would come back as costs for the railway. And finally, how efficient were the overall process. So the study initially was inward looking at the UK, its processes and experiences, and then outward looking to Europe to see where we can pick up best practice. And I don't want to give like the conclusions at the end away too much, but there is no perfect system. All systems balance safety, risk, and cost and time, and we need to create a safe system, but we also need to create a system that's affordable. Network Rail receives its funding in 5-year control period, so it has a 5-year fixed budget. We're currently in control period 7, which runs from April 2024 to March 2029. The next control period, which is control period 8, starts in April 2029. So the review here is to inform that next control period, which doesn't start till 2029, but actually it takes several years to agree what the next funding is. Hence, this study now is informing that. The final review into funding will actually take place in 2028. So this is leading into a 2-year period of reviewing what costs and efficiencies are in order to set funding for 2029 onwards for the next 5 years. So the work has started now, but we're looking at really long-term things, long-term changes to improve the efficiency of the railway. This isn't about making significant changes today. So, what is the UK product acceptance process? I'm going to go through how it works for those who don't know or have never done that in the UK. It does differ in many ways from Europe, and you all know your own product approval processes or homologation processes. So I'm sure you can start to see where there are differences. This is also really oversimplified. There are multiple standards and processes. I've combined them into an easy list. So my real caveat is if you're a supplier thinking of supplying to the UK, please go through all the standards. Don't just listen to this presentation now or recording later. So, firstly, you need to identify if you even need product acceptance, and products are broken into a number of categories that decide whether they need to be go through the process or not. So you have controlled but limited criticality, uncontrolled, and just entirely not in scope of product acceptance. So firstly, controlled items are products that will impact on safety or the reliability of the railway. So very clearly, the infrastructure manager would need to accept that product before it can come into the railway, and controlled products need to go through a full product acceptance process in the UK. You then have controlled but limited criticality. These are items that could have an impact, but are generally commercial off-the-shelf products. So don't need the same level of acceptance. They really just need to demonstrate they meet national standards. So examples of those might be things like tools that are used on the railway, or oils or diesel, things that are used. They do need to meet standards, but you're not going to get an oil or a grease product approved generally unless it was for a special use. Uncontrolled parts are parts that still need product numbers from Network Rail, but don't need product acceptance. So a ladder would need a number, but doesn't need to go through a product acceptance process. A high-vis vest to wear on a construction site won't impact on the reliability of the railway or the safe running of trains, but it does need to meet standards. So again, they're uncontrolled, but do need to get a number and demonstrate they meet standards. And then there are some things that don't even form part of this process. The process is really focused on the safe and reliable running of trains. So often things in a station don't have to go through this process. So things like if I work in a station, my laptop does not need product approval. Yeah, things that won't impact on trains. Another example is the building, because it's not a product. So if you're building a new building, that doesn't need product acceptance because it's a building, not a product. It still needs to go through approvals as any other building would on or off the railway. So you've identified you have a product and it needs to get product acceptance. Once you've done this, the first thing you'll need to do is find a sponsor. So in the UK, a sponsor is a person within Network Rail. So there will be a Network Rail employee who has a need for the part, and they will be the person who actually submits the application. And this is the first thing where we really change from many European countries, where as a supplier, I cannot submit an application to Network Rail. I have to find an end user in Network Rail who would then submit the application. So generally, this would not be someone in the HQ. It would be head of a maintenance unit or a project manager on a project. So it's someone on a project or in maintenance who has a real need for a product, and they will do the submission. So suppliers cannot submit an application. It needs to be the sponsor. That sponsor will also develop the business case and follow the product the whole way through the process. So the people managing product acceptance will interface with the sponsor, and the sponsor will interface with the supplier who actually makes the part. The supplier will also need to complete design for reliability, and this is a Network Rail specific version of RAMS. So reliability, availability, maintainability, and safety assessment. Network Rail doesn't entirely follow the European standards for RAMS. It has its own design for reliability standard. So a supplier would need to complete the design for reliability again before they can get an application through with a sponsor. Once you've done this, the sponsor will submit the initial application, and that will have an initial review of it. As part of that review, they'll look at what's the level of criticality. So it may be controlled, but is it a critical product or is it low critical? And that decision will impact upon how onerous again the review process will be. If it's low criticality, it might be quite a simple process, have a single discipline review. And as it moves up the level of criticality, it might start needing trials. It might start needing multidisciplinary reviews. It might start needing independent safety assessments as well. So that initial review will decide that, along with the risk assessments and criticality reviews. It will then go to a lead reviewer who does an assessment, and they will set the initial requirements for the product. So they will list, here's the tests I need to see, here's the evidence I need to see, and that will go through the sponsor and supplier back to the supplier to actually complete. It may then go to a system review panel, and there are both local and national system review panels, and these are normally multidisciplinary panels of engineers who review products. So some products, if it's for a particular project in a region of the UK, may need to go for a local as well as a national system review panel. And again, they may set further requirements and need further assurance. They may also require trials, and those trials could be operational trials, so on the actual mainline railway, or they could be at a test track. or they could be both. You need to do a trial first at a test track, and then you need to do a trial on the mainline railway. And then the final thing, you've gone through all that assurance. You then at the end get a certificate to say the product is accepted, and that acceptance may be indefinite, or it may be for a fixed time period. It may be while we do trials, or it may be while we gather further reliability information. So it's only temporary for 2 years until we've gathered further reliability information. Separate to this, so you may get a certificate. That still doesn't mean you can supply to the railway. Suppliers to the railway may also have to go through RISCs, which is the Rail Industry Supplier Qualification Scheme. So the supplier qualification scheme. So anyone who's supplying to the railway, whether they're supplying products accepted parts or not, needs to be an approved supplier, and that may require audits and paperwork as well. That's separate to this process, but is another task that the supplier needs to undertake. So, yeah, what are the existing UK issues? So this was one of the reasons why the ORR had started their study. So over the previous few years, lots of suppliers had complained to the ORR about the process and how Network Rail deployed it. So individual suppliers had gone to the ORR with a whole list of complaints. But the ORR were really struggling to understand, were the complaints reflecting like a systemic issue, like a failure in the process, or were these just individual suppliers who perhaps didn't have a commercial avenue for their product and were venting some frustration. So the number of complaints directly to the ORR was relatively small, because lots of people wouldn't have complained to a regulator who doesn't typically manage this process. So yeah, it was difficult to gauge, I think, is this a narrow band or is this a real underlying issue? And the complaints really came down to 8 significant topics. You could group them together. So firstly, at the start, there wasn't a pass-fail criteria. So at the start of making an application, suppliers didn't always know, what done looked like, what documents they needed to submit. There was some guidance, but often it was unclear. And this would lead to further rework later on. If you didn't know what test document you needed and you only found it out halfway through a process, that might have a cost impact. The second point was inconsistent interpretation. So depending on who reviewed the product and who the sponsor was, there was inconsistent interpretation of standards and requirements. So the level of work, depending on individuals, who the individual application went through. Also, point number 3, changing requirements, links really closely to point number 1. The requirements also changed during the process. So you may have a reviewer who gives a requirement, you may fulfill that, but when it gets to a system review panel, you may have a changed requirement or a further requirement that again could have a commercial or time impact. So yeah, the requirements are unclear at the start, and they could change during the process. Another impact, another issue was the lack of proportionality. So it wasn't always felt that the mitigations were met the level of risk. So sometimes there were huge lists of requirements for relatively low risk product. Staff turnover was another really key item. So particularly when you relied on a sponsor, if a sponsor's someone in a project, a project engineer or a project manager is highly likely to go and work on another project at some point. If your product is still going through the process, that would mean a different sponsor picking it up. That new sponsor might think differently about the product, they might have less time, they might be busy, they might be less enthusiastic, and that could have a very significant impact. Hidden costs. And that was essentially because not all the criteria were known and there was inconsistent interpretation and the requirements could change. That meant it was very difficult to estimate costs at the start. There was limited supply chain awareness within Network Rail, and this really is lack of feeling of lack of commercial awareness within Network Rail staff, and also a view that lots of the tasks being undertaken didn't really add value. Some things were very expensive, but didn't really add any value to the level of risks that would be incorporated into the railway. The picture on the right is actually from a product approval application I made 8 years ago. There are 14 lever arch files of documents, and I think I've got them still somewhere in a cupboard somewhere in the office. Nowadays, this would all be electronically. It was mainly electronically 8 years ago, but at the time I kept hand-signed signatures of everything. So there is a huge amount of documentation required. But yeah, one of the issues, the real underlying issue actually was that ORR had was, are these just a few suppliers moaning, or is there really any underlying issue? Do they have to, should they be concerned about the efficiency of the railway, or is it actually something quite superficial? And it's an ongoing issue. A lot of the study was qualitative interviews with people from the UK and around Europe who are suppliers who put products on the railway. And when you interview people, you always have to worry about, are these really facts or are these feelings? So a big part of this study when doing interviews and looking at feedback was also considering some of those human factors to try and get the facts underneath and deal with as well different cultures. So I got probably unusual for an engineering presentation. I have a few slides on culture, and I'm going to explain the relevance. If you work on international projects, I'd really recommend a book by John Mole, which is called Mind Your Manners, Managing Business Cultures in Europe. And he interviewed thousands of people across Europe in business and looked at how they reacted to different situations. And I've got 3 charts really quickly I'll run through, but there's many more in the book. Firstly, do they say clearly what they think? And I often work with my German colleagues, and the UK and Germany are almost at complete extremes, and so is the Netherlands. For some countries, you just can't take interviews on a surface value. You really do have to consider the culture and dig into what they're saying and the facts, even if that feels a little unengineering. And I also want to add culture changes, obviously, from person to person and region to region and industry to industry. In his book, John Mole does go through that in a lot more detail. But yes, this is a simplified overview. And for instance, my company's HQ is in Switzerland, and there are clear differences between the French and German speaking parts, but also between industries. And I've seen differences in cultures between railway and banking. So these are, super broad categories. Yeah, another culture slide is how flexible people are, or do they just follow procedures? And yeah, that was really important because as I interviewed people and asked them, well, I've read the process, how different is reality from the process? I can imagine colleagues in Switzerland and Germany thinking, well, we just follow the process, whereas depending on where you are in Europe, that may be less and less the case. So there's a big range in Europe of how far people deviate from a written process and how flexible they are when it comes to procedures. And then the last of my slides is I put in for a particular reason as well is how much business culture depends on personal relationships, and for once the UK is actually a lot closer to Germany and the Netherlands than we were on the previous slides. However, I think in the UK rail bucks that trend because there is a heavy dependence on individuals through sponsors. So that may come back to industries, being different. So what was the process for doing the report? So it's fairly simple. We took information that the ORR had given us, so the feedback they had already had. And then we interviewed lots of people here in the UK to see where reality differs. And the majority were companies who had made applications, but we also interviewed wider bodies who represent lots of groups. So although the number of interviews was relatively small, it actually covered a fairly broad group. We then did a similar process for 4 European countries to act as comparators, so Italy, Switzerland, France, and Germany. And we chose these for a number of reasons. One, really simple, we had people in our organisation who could speak the languages the processes were written in, which made it a lot easier. Also, all those countries have lots of processes online, so it's very easy to access. And also we found people we could interview who were suppliers who had gone through the process. So we then reviewed the UK processes against the feedback against the processes, and then again looked at the comparator processes and the feedback of how close reality was. And then we made some recommendations for current and future structure of product acceptance processes in the UK. So what were the overarching feedback from the UK? So we did over 20 interviews. As I said, they weren't just individual suppliers. Some of them were trade bodies who had hundreds of members. So it was quite a wide spectrum, but also so was the feedback. We had some positive suppliers who had gone, oh yeah, the process was great, went really well. And to the far extreme of negative. Most people had some complaints, but there were positive people in there. But there was a really wide spread. There was very few suppliers who had a similar experience. And I think that underlying such a wide spectrum of feedback did show an underlying issue with the system, that no one had a similar experience of the process. No one just said, yeah, the process was as it's written and it was smooth sailing. So that does show some underlying issues. We also had lots of those suppliers who had supplied products in other European countries. So they might have been European companies supplying to the UK or vice versa. So they could also give us some really interesting feedback on comparisons as well. But the most, the real feedback here was the infrastructure manager Network Rail is more embedded in the process than other comparators. So at every step of the way, the infrastructure manager is deeply involved, whereas in some other countries, you would have gone to some assessment body who's looking at your paperwork. The infrastructure manager would have been provided some criteria at the start, but actually they wouldn't be going through all your paperwork on that first pass. It would be to someone else, whereas every step of the route, the infrastructure manager is embedded in that process. The sponsorship role in the UK is also, I think, unusual, that you needed like a project sponsor for every stage in the UK, and that sponsorship role was absolutely critical. You needed an enthusiastic sponsor who had time, who was interested in it, who didn't leave his job, and if any of those didn't happen, you would be in trouble. There are also significant comments on the system review panels. So these are like the interdisciplinary panels So the real highlight there was lots of requirements came out very late in the process. The system review panel's quite a way through the process, but requirements would happen and they would change over multiple system review panels. The testing and evidence requirements were set super late compared to lots of places in Europe. Design for reliability was also a pain point, albeit it's not part of the formal product acceptance process. It is a separate process in its own right, but you do need to go through the design for reliability process. Lots of the comments were essentially, I have a RAMS report that's been signed off by a body in Europe. I want to bring it to the UK, but I have to essentially do a report from scratch here in the UK. And you can, the standards do allow for the transferability of data and reports such as RAMS to the UK, but normally it needs a derogation from standards. And generally there is an avoidance within Network Rail of derogating. So you end up having to do lots of new paperwork. And again, linking into that is actually quite difficult to transfer proven products from elsewhere. So we had a really good example, and I won't name the company, who had a diesel motor powered hand tool in Europe that had moved to batteries. So yeah, across Europe, everywhere else, they were starting to use a battery operated version of this. It was a hand operated track tool. But in Europe, they didn't want to go, in the UK, sorry, they didn't want to go through an onerous product approval process. So it just decided to carry on manufacturing a diesel version for the UK rather than dealing with the pain of that. So yeah, what did we find from Europe? And I'm not going to talk through each country as I realise I'm probably overrunning on my estimated time. But also, I think you all know your own countries far better than I will. You know, I've looked at them for a few weeks each. I'm not an expert in each, so you'll know more. But there's clearly a long-term move towards a single market across Europe, and this has. I really see some real long-term benefits to costs and ease of movement. And in the very short term, when you get to a product, when you want to apply for a product to get into the EU market, it can seem bureaucratic and there are some hurdles to get over. But in the long run, there are clear benefits. We did see products that have been able to be supplied to multiple countries relatively easily. So there is clearly it's a long-term process. And the other thing that really surprised me was all four countries were moving along that process, but very different speeds. So some countries had really adopted that mindset of being able to take components from one country to another. Lots of other countries were still going down that route, albeit there was clear intent. So, yeah, what was the differences between the four countries? So, yeah, as I said, qualitative interviews are impacted by culture. And as I said, everyone was moving on that path to like EU homologation, so standard set of rules. Depending on where you were, local standards and requirements were often overlaid on top. So, yeah, in many countries, it wasn't quite as simple as just taking your paperwork from one country. You still had to show you met local requirements. But it did allow innovative products to come into the railway easier. But then it still depended on how many requirements were overlaid. Another comment from some countries was that documents needed repackaging in a format that a local infrastructure manager or regulator would accept, which again has a time and cost implication. And some countries had very bespoke testing requirements. Others would just accept testing from somewhere else. And again, the level of involvement of the infrastructure manager, while nowhere was quite as high as the UK, that did vary from country to country. And also most countries still require some form of supplier qualification. RAMs versus DFR. So I think I've got the V&V process up from Germany, Italy, and France there to show 3 of the languages. And I think the RAMs process is a very good and sensible process, and it really does allow for the transferability of data. Again, as I said, the UK does allow RAMs, but it requires a derogation from the DFR process, and I don't think that. Yeah, I think people just avoid it and go through the DFR process. So I really see some benefits to Europe from just following a common policy and standard. So yeah, what were the recommendations of the report? So the first one was who should be reviewing and assessing that technical file. So in lots of countries that was done by independent bodies, not by the infrastructure manager. And I in the long run, I do see a huge benefit in that because one, it will make it easier for other countries to bring their technical files to the UK and vice versa, but also it will remove a lot of that personal relationship from the process. We're just following a process, not relying on individuals and people. How do we define the requirements at the start? At the moment, the requirements are set in the UK as we go along that process. I really do see benefits, and most countries do it, of right at the start of the process, defining those requirements before you ever submit an application, so you know on day one what the requirements are, and that really allows suppliers to decide, well, what's the budget, what's the estimate, do I want to do this, is there a market? I can forecast the costs because I can write down what tests, what reports I need to do. How do we manage change control? So if we are going to change some requirements halfway through because new information comes to light, how do we manage that so we're commercially aware of the impact? We need to make it in the UK much easier for proven products to be accepted, both from the EU and from other industries. We need to be much more willing to accept standard formats of documents from Europe and allow them to be used in the UK. As I said, they are allowed to be used, but often the steps to get there are so onerous, people avoid it. We need to reduce the dependence on individuals and individual roles and move much more to just following processes, going back to my culture diagram. So we shouldn't be relying on a sponsor who might not be in the same job in 6 months, and if he changes or she changes, the whole process falls down. We shouldn't have that dependence. The UK measures lots of key performance indicators for product acceptance, but they're normally related to time. So how many weeks has it taken to go through the process? How many weeks does it take to approve? How many weeks does Network Rail submit requirements back to a supplier? Actually, our KPIs need to be much more focused on outcomes. What are the benefits for the railways? Those products that offer significant benefits and cost savings or support decarbonisation, we might need to support those products through a lot more. How do we allow for innovation better? The current process doesn't always support innovation. Innovation comes at many different stages, and if you're relying on a sponsor who's working on a project that has a live requirement now, that doesn't really support innovation. New innovative products can take 4 or 6 years. A sponsor who has a requirement for this year just won't be interested in taking that through the product acceptance. And then finally, we should do a lot more checking with the supply chain, and Network Rail has already made huge steps in doing this anyway. But yeah, should be able to find out very early are some of these issues really issues, because we can get a lot more feedback from suppliers. So suppliers, we should be communicating a lot better between the infrastructure manager and suppliers about the overall performance of the system. I've sped up as I went through, as I realised I've been talking too much at the start, so apologies. The report will be published at some point. However, I've put a QR code here with a link to it on our server. So if you did want to read it, yeah, feel free to download a copy. As I said, this is really looking at long-term changes. So we're looking to inform the processes over the next coming years. And even as Network Rail becomes Great British Rail, this isn't about some quick fix I can just implement tomorrow. So I'm not expecting the process to dramatically change tomorrow, but I hope over the next few years we can see a difference. So yeah, feel free to download a copy. I'm sure I can send to the organisers a link as well after this. Yeah, and then finally, yeah, thanks for listening. I've got my email there. I think this will go out on the slides later if yeah, if you need to email me or have any questions after this. But Marco, yes, over to you, I think, for questions.
Thank you very much, Noel. And thank you for this insights in the matter and this detailed presentation. For me, it was very interesting. I remember to all the participants that if you have questions, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand. And I want to give some comments to what you have shown to us. And we have seen that we need the simplification. We have many different ways of thinking. I know that it's very difficult, but I think this is the way we should follow. I want to comment two other points in your presentation. One is regarding Great British Airways. I want to say welcome to Great British Airways because I know that is that the UK goes back to the original airways with no separation between infrastructure
yes.
and the train operating companies. That is something that I really believe on this. This is the situation that we have in Switzerland, because it can be that organization, the separation could give more competition, but I think, or I'm convinced that if the organization, the processes are important, but people are more important. So it's better that we have good people that understand what is the scope that we have, and the other comes for me in a second position. Then you said
just
that.
Sorry, just to add on that, when I worked in London Underground, we also had train operators go over some of our track, and I worked in fault attribution, and I think the current separation leads to lots of arguments. Every time there was a train delay, there would be an argument: was it the fault of the infrastructure? Was it the fault of the train? What was the root cause, and who could we blame? And as a passenger, you don't care whose fault it is. You just want to get to work on time. So I completely agree with you. Moving track and train to a single organisation, I think, will be to the benefit of passengers and freight.
Thank you, Noel. Then you've talked about processes, and you've showed how Switzerland and Germany are very very tight. And I had today a discussion about this in Switzerland, and yes, I know that processes are very important. They help us in many situations, but sometimes it seems that we are like in different territories, and everyone defends its own. So it's good what you have presented, because it gives an overview how we are, how are the different culture in Europe, and I know that it's easy to say, but it's difficult to do this. We should find a point between disadvantages and disadvantages of the different position. Okay, then there are some questions. The first one is from Andy Moore. Asks for a non-controlled product to be installed in track. Who would take responsibility for the product's performances? Would it be the contractor that installs the products? As this can deter them from using non-controlled products. Thank you.
I think whether it's controlled or uncontrolled depends on risk. So for like a sleeper, for instance, on a piece of, on track, it would just be controlled because it is critical to the railway. So you couldn't choose, you wouldn't have a choice between an uncontrolled or a controlled product. For that class of product, they would all be controlled or uncontrolled. So you're not comparing. It also doesn't change liability. So if I work on a project, whether it's controlled on or uncontrolled, if something fails, Network Rail will still come to me and say, why's your product failed? Normally on a construction project, which is my experience, it would come to the prime, the main contractor, and it would work its way back from there. You really only want to get a new product in if you're on a project, if you have a real need and you can see something that really can save you time or cost. You have to be motivated to want to get a new product in.
Okay, thank you very much, Noel. And then there is a short question from Jenny Cook. Asks, could you provide the name of the business cultures book again? It was Moles.
Yes, it was Mind Your Manners. Sorry, I realised afterwards I hadn't put it on the slide. Mind Your Manners, which is and the subtitle on it was like Managing Business Cultures. But it was by John Mole, Mole. And yeah, it's a few years old. It's probably 10, 15 years. So I'm sure you can get it on Amazon, but I don't know if it's still in print. So hopefully that answers your question, Jenny.
I hope so. If it's not the case, I ask Jenny to raise the hand. Then we have a new question from Toby Johnson. Did your study consider interoperability constituents? From what I've seen, this can be a cause of great confusion from the infrastructure managers.
Yes. So, for instance, if you remember back to my slide with the photo with all the folders, that was for the system, which was an interoperable constituent. So we had to go through a NOBO, SPO, DEBO to get that signed off, as well as product acceptance for the individual components. So the product acceptance is really focused on, the components. From a TSI perspective, you still need to have that approved and go through that process, albeit in the UK it's now NTSNs, but essentially they're a copy and paste of European standards. So it goes alongside product acceptance.
Okay, thank you very much, Noel. In the meantime, Jenny is happy with your answer. I'm happy too. And I would like to put the last questions. It's a very theoretical question, and maybe it's a difficult question, but based on your experience and all this work that you have done, we are talking from many years in Europe about the standardization, simplification, and so on. Why doesn't work?
I really see Europeans going along that process. So when I looked at, say, Switzerland, where you are, Marco, I can really see, and the same with Italy, they are really going along that process, and it is a lot easier to get products across borders than it used to be. And there are still requirements, local standards and requirements over the top, but it takes a long time to change that railway culture. But you are definitely going down the right path of that slowly changing. So yeah, I think it is already easier than it was 10 years ago to bring a product across. And you know, previously railway suppliers would all be individual to their own countries, and it's definitely slowly becoming a more single market. And I know Switzerland sits outside the EU, but is following in terms of railways most of those processes.
Okay, thank you very much, Noel. I don't see any raised hand, and I don't see no new questions. So I thank you very much, you, Noel, for this presentation.
Thank you.
I thank you also for Frey, both for your times and your added value to the competence and experience in the railway market. And so I can close this railway talk. I want to remember that the next one should be, if nothing happens against, it will be on the 9th of June. And so I wish all of you a good evening and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.